Okay, we're going to start our next panel. 1 minute late, but we'll do better next time. All right, so the way we're going to do these panels is I'm just going to introduce the moderator of each panel briefly, turn it over to them, and they will manage the introductions of panelists in their own ways. So very happy to have Sean O'Connor here, noted intellectual law scholar, professor of law and faculty director of the Center for Intellectual Property and Innovation Policy, or CIP Square, as they call it, at George Mason University, Antonin Scalia Law School, a program of scope and size that I only dream that Pi can one day become. They were previously Boeing International Professor of Law at the University of Washington School of Law in Seattle. Their research focuses on intellectual property and business law with regard to startups and commercializing technology and arts and innovation. In the 2022 to 2023 academic year, Sean is on leave of absence from George Mason Antonin Scalia Law School to teach here at DC Law. We're very fortunate and very happy about that. I'll turn it over to you, Sean.
Thanks.
All right.
Thanks so much. All right. Welcome, everyone. Excited to be here. Thanks to David and Pi and DC Law for this, and Ropes and Gray to put together this awesome program. Now, we have a great panel this morning, and what we're going to be looking at is both intellectual property and a lot of tech policy issues. And this is the global panel, so we're going to be talking about lots of hotspots. There's no lack of things going on in the world right now, right? And even though we might think about the geopolitical part of that, that occupies most of the news, but in our corner of the world with IP and tech law, these all have big impacts. And so we have a great set of speakers then. So what we'll do for the format is they'll each have about 10 to 12 minutes to give their kind of introductory remarks from their different perspectives. And then we'll do some guided discussion and then have time for audience Q&A. So I'd love for all of you to be thinking about the questions you have. There will be microphones that will be available so that then, and please wait until you get the microphone to ask your question. First up, by arrangement of the panelists themselves, is Michael Mangelson, who we've known each other for a while. We bounce into each other at things. Principal Counsel and Director for China IP at the Office of Policy and International Affairs at the USPTO. He has been there for a number of years, and after serving for 5 years as the U.S. IP attaché in Shanghai. So he has deep China experience and has been over there. He advises and coordinates with U.S. government agencies and China counterparts to resolve IP issues, promote U.S. IP policy, encourage effective IP protection, and secure high IP standards. You know, that has been a thing we've had with China, but a lot of moves have happened over there, and so things are changing. So I want to turn, in the interest of time, to give everyone maximum time, I'm just going to read that kind of initial part of the bio and then get ready to our speakers. So Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you, David, for inviting me back. I participated in this event 3 years ago. Made a lot of good friends at that time. It's always a little bit, I think validating to be invited back, although it's been 3 years, so maybe people forget. But I appreciate this opportunity, and I thank the organizers and Michelle and Ed for helping us get organized. It's interesting. I look back 3 years ago and where we were at in that relationship with China, and we were finalizing negotiations in the phase 1 trade deal with China, and really had some different things to talk about at that time. I think in many ways, if you take a look over the last 3 years, the way that things have developed. And I'll just share this, I think, anecdote or this story. I had a friend a couple months ago who was working for a U.S. company in China, came back to the United States. We got together, and he told me he just felt really, especially in D.C., he felt uncomfortable knowing how much he should share about what he does in China, just because he felt like China had become a dirty word. And I really feel that that's so unfortunate. I appreciated Professor Huang's remarks this morning, where he was talking about the importance of this relationship, which I absolutely agree with. I think China continues to be a large market with significant opportunities for U.S. companies. Who take a look at our bilateral relationship, it's still by far the largest bilateral trade partner that we have in the United States. And you take a look at last year, Just look in terms of exports. It made up almost 10% of total global exports, U.S. companies exporting to China. And many of those companies are small, medium-sized enterprises, which is a demographic that we work with closely in my office at the PTO. And many of them, I think, find that market is very important to their business. If you take a look at some of the polling recently from the American Chambers of Commerce in China, as well as U.S.-China Business Council, CBC just last month came out with some polling that showed that more than 90% of our companies that are in China right now have made a profit this year. And I think if you take a look, though, at also some of the information about where things are heading, there is, I think, a trend towards more pessimism. That particular survey also noted that about half of the members felt more pessimistic about their outlook in China. This is down 18% from last year and was the lowest number that they've ever had in the 20 years of their survey. And I think if you look at the polling and kind of talk to companies, there are really there are a number of different factors, I think, that lead to that pessimism. Frankly, the top of that list is the zero COVID policy and some of the unpredictable lockdowns that companies have faced. It's very difficult to get people in and out of China. We know because we have 3 offices in China. We have IP attachés there, my team, and have had difficult times. One of our IP attachés just got out in Shanghai. It took over a year to get her out there. She went through the 3 weeks of quarantine and then got stuck in the lockdowns in Shanghai. I had to bring her back, and fortunately she's back out there again. And I think that's important because this engagement that we have with China and finding more contact points, be able to conduct, engage in dialogue and better understand where our relationship is, I think that's crucial to the future of that relationship. And unfortunately, I think the deteriorating bilateral relationship has also come into play, and companies also note that as one of the areas that they feel most concerned about, because I think if we're not talking and we don't have a clear set of rules and policy as it relates to how we engage with China, it makes it very difficult to do business in China because you don't know what to expect. They need clarity, they need consistency, they need the stability in that relationship and in our policy to be successful there. If we take a look at IP, which is what I'm going to be focusing on today, and I appreciate that. And do we need to do anything to make sure it's shared, or is it already being shared? Okay, thanks, Michelle. So I'm going to focus a little bit in on kind of where things stand in our relationship. I'm focused first on some of the positive developments. So last year, or 3 years ago, I mentioned that we were working on the Phase 1 trade deal, which was signed later in 2020. And really, over the course of the last 3 years, we've used that as a framework in engaging closely with the agencies, our counterpart agencies in China, on implementing the commitments in that agreement. You take a look at that agreement. I know if you look in the press, most people think it was a failure because they focus on purchase commitments. But 2/3 of that agreement, really the purpose of that agreement was IP abuses, forced transfers of technology. And so if you take a look at and kind of evaluate it from that perspective, at least at this stage, I think you have to say that it was a big success because China, in meeting its commitments or trying to implement those commitments, issued and adopted more than 70 new legislative measures. If you take a look at history, this is the most that they've done in terms of IP reform ever in their history. Even if you take a look at 22 years ago during the session talks for WTO. So I think that is a big positive development. Now, implementation is once you have those measures that are adopted, obviously implementing them at the local level, that's the next step, and we're kind of in that stage right now. It makes it difficult during the COVID kind of lockdowns to see how that's actually progressing. But we do see a lot of companies that do have favorable outcomes in judicial decisions, administrative decisions, primarily in the areas of non-technical IP. Those are areas perhaps of trademark infringement, counterfeiting, copyright infringement. I think there are still some issues, maybe new issues that we're dealing with as it relates to technical IP, especially in those areas where maybe China is targeting emerging technologies under industrial policy. So these are some of the, if you take a look down below here on my screen here, I've noted some of the areas where protections I think have improved. And it starts from the policy side at the highest levels of the government, where we've also seen that China's economic policy has acknowledged that innovation is a primary driving force behind their future development, and that protecting IP is key to fostering that innovation and that development. And so I think that is a positive development. But on the flip side, and if you can take me to the next slide, I think that if you take a look at some of the other policy statements that are coming out of the leadership at the highest levels of China, IP is becoming highly politicized and used as a tool for national development. Now, I think some can argue that the United States is also doing some of the same things. But I think if you take a look at how they're implementing that policy in China, there lies the concern. The party leadership is placing more limits on ownership of critical IP and on the expansion of rights of individuals and enterprises. And I think it's also telling to note that the courts and the administrative agencies have been ordered to assist in eliminating China's reliance on what they refer to as the stranglehold technologies, such as semiconductors, and to promote more self-sufficiency in the science and technology. And unfortunately, I think the politicization of IP as a tool for economic development and national security has been undermining the fair and non-discriminatory treatment of IP owned by rights holders. And I could go into some more statistics, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to go down and I think talk a little bit about where I think things are headed. We have, I think right now, if you could advance to the next slide. Thanks, Michelle. And talk a little bit about what the future holds. And I think we're really at a crucial time in the relationship, and if you take a look at what's happening over the course of the next 2 months, I think this could be telling in terms of how we continue on this trajectory towards IP improvements in China. We've got the National Party Congress coming up on Sunday, and it looks like Xi Jinping is going to be reelected for a third, fifth, 5-year term. I think once that happens, and also we have our midterm elections coming up in the United States domestically next month. I think once we get that out of the way, there's, I think, a great opportunity for us to maybe re-engage on many of these issues and take a look at how we're going to address the relationship going forward. And I think, as I mentioned before, many of our companies in the business environment, also in universities, other stakeholders, are seeking for more direction in our trade relationship with China. We derive, as I mentioned before, important benefits from our exports and investments in China. And we want our companies to be able to thrive in global markets, including China. We need to redefine how we trade and invest with China, and we need to do this in ways that are disciplined, that are consistent and transparent to the business communities, to universities, and to our other stakeholders. We need to rebuild a robust partnership between the government and private sector. We can't have the private sector feeling that China is a dirty word, and we can't talk about that. And the private sector will need to also adapt its behavior, I think, to reflect the more challenging economic and security threat posed by China. For example, possibly by limiting some types of R&D in China, moving parts of supply chains out of China, and rethinking future trade and investment practices. But I think at the end, I just want to make this point that I think that we need to find more opportunities to engage in China and try to work out these differences. I look forward to spending the next 2 days with everyone here, and hopefully we can go into more details on some of these issues. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike. That was perfect. And a great segue into, we have Emma Adams, who is, I believe, here and ready. And so Emma is the managing partner of the Ropes and Grays Washington, D.C. office, partner in the firm's litigation and enforcement practice, over 20 years of experience advising clients on international transactions and U.S. government's regulation of trade and investment, includes most notably export controls, economic sanctions, anti-corruption and anti-money laundering, foreign direct investment, custom laws and regulations. So this is a perfect segue that Mike set up at the end. And then a lot of what we're looking at is not just IP issues, but how do we actually do the business transactions, and a subject near and dear to my heart, which is know how and show how. How does that happen? I'm thinking about export controls and the ways in which we try to control or not control the diffusion of technology transfer, not just from universities to the private sector, but private sector coming to private sector and state to state. So now I'll turn it over to Emma.
Thank you so much, Sean, and hopefully you all can hear me okay. And so, as Sean just noted, I'm going to sort of provide some context around, what is going on with respect to Russia in response to its invasion into Ukraine and how that is affecting industries, including the tech industry, trying to figure out what they can and cannot do with respect to Russia. To put it in some context, I just wanted to start out by sort of saying that, U.S. economic sanctions have been a long central element of U.S. foreign policy to counter perceived Russian aggression and activities. As you all know, the U.S. imposed sanctions against Russia for its invasion in Crimea in 2014. There were sanctions put in place with respect to Russia for its interference in the 2016 election. But by and large, the impact of those sanctions had been largely restrained and incredibly focused. But in this past year, in response to the events on the ground in Ukraine that started this spring, unlike other sanctions that did not broadly target the Russian economy or entire sectors, we are now seeing a concerted global effort amongst the US, the EU, the UK, and other allies to put together an extensive set of sanctions against Russia. And the impact of those sanctions is really a significant disruption of doing business with Russia, with Russian entities, for companies that have investments, employees, infrastructure in Russia. It's an increasingly complex regulatory landscape to cover. So in terms of kind of the agenda for this presentation, I'm really going to be offering kind of a high-level summary of the regulations and then some practical considerations that companies need to be thinking about, particularly in the tech sector, with respect to U.S. sanctions. So starting off with what we have seen, it's really been kind of a comprehensive set of sanctions and restrictions from the Treasury Department, Office of Foreign Asset Control, OFAC, and also the Commerce Department, the Bureau of Industry and Security. And the package of sanctions that have rolled out at a very fast clip and a very coordinated effort have included ban on new investment in the Russian Federation, major financial institutions being placed on what we call OFAC's SDN list, which means that U.S. companies, U.S. persons wherever they're located, anyone located in the United States are generally prohibited from engaging in transactions with persons on that list. A whole series of debt and equity restrictions that have targeted, dozens and dozens of Russian firms. And when we think about debt and equity restrictions, sort of the equity restrictions are sort of the traditional one: shares, purchase of shares, sale of shares. But debt can include things such as, selling a product to a Russian entity on a list and wanting to get paid for that. There are restrictions on how quickly you can get that money back, up to 14 days. And if the invoice is left out there longer, that is in itself a breach of the Russia sanctions. We've seen certain parts of Ukraine become prohibited locations because of Russian presence in those regions. And then we've also seen import and export restrictions on the flow of goods into the United States from Russia and into Russia. So that is sort of a broad magnitude of sanctions and export restrictions that have rolled out in the last 7 to 8 months. And while they don't lead up to a comprehensive ban on dealing with Russia, Russia is not considered to be at this date on the same level of Iran, so to speak, as being a comprehensively sanctioned country. The complexity of the sanctions are making it increasingly difficult for companies to do business in and with Russian entities. So I want to focus next on the new investment restrictions and what that means. And OFAC has decided that, or clarified that, investment means really essentially sort of the commitment of capital or other assets for the purposes of generating returns or appreciations. And that is an extremely broad definition, and in fact took OFAC almost 6 to 8 weeks to come out with guidance around what the term investment meant. And the guidance they provided to date, provide more clarity on what it means by investment, but it continues to be broad, right? Purchase or acquisition of real estate, the commitment of capital or assets to start up joint ventures or other corporations in the Russian Federation. Certainly what we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years in the tech sector in particular is joint venture, collaboration agreements, research agreements with entities in Russia have been a way for technology companies to sort of take advantage of the market in Russia, and those are very much being impacted by these new investment restrictions. There's also prohibitions on entering into agreements that provide for the participation of royalties or profits that are coming from the Russian Federation. There are restrictions on lending funds to persons who are located in Russia for commercial purposes. And then bans or restrictions on the purchase of equity interests in entities that are located in the Russian Federation. So sort of the range of what that means is it is, while Russia is not a comprehensively sanctioned country, it is increasingly challenging to enter into new arrangements, new opportunities in Russia because of this definition of new investment. In terms of, just touching on this, it's not on the slide, but just want to touch on this in terms of what OFAC has said is not new investment. It is, the maintenance of existing investments that one had in Russia before this ban on investment went into place. So if you're just trying to maintain investment, pay leases that are owed because of, or pay employees due to a prior existing relationship, that can be generally provided for. Or if you're trying to wind down or extricate yourself from the Russian market, that itself is not prohibited, but it is certainly a tricky landscape that we're trying to see companies navigate. And then when you, moving on, when you look at, take that new investment restriction and layer on top of that the number of Russian entities that have been added to the SDN list, in particular financial institutions, that is increasingly another challenge. So if an entity appears on the SDN list, as I noted, U.S. persons, U.S. firms are prohibited from engaging in transactions with them. And that also includes any entities that are 50% or more owned by an entity on that list. And to date, we have probably over 40 or so Russian financial institutions that have been blocked, including the second largest Russian bank by assets. The key Russian sovereign wealth fund has been added to the blocking list. Several Russian oligarchs, their family members, entities that they own 50% or more, have also been impacted by their identification on this SDN list. And so the cascading effect of the investment restrictions and the number of institutions, including financial institutions that are, per se prohibited persons, means the flow of money in and out of Russia is incredibly stilted and chilled. And while it is not prohibited to engage in certain activities in Russia, just the very fact that the payment system has been so impacted by these restrictions makes it increasingly difficult. And then I just wanted to touch on sort of export and import regulations in thinking about sort of how the U.S. government applies its international trade investment restrictions. We have sanctions that target specific industries and prohibit U.S. persons from dealing with them. And then in terms of export control restrictions, that applies to any items that have U.S. origin components in them, any items that are shipped from the United States overseas, and any foreign manufactured items that have certain sensitive U.S. technologies embedded in them. And really what the U.S. government has done is said that a wide swath of items are now subject to export control licensing restrictions. So to export items from the United States to Russia or from a third country to Russia, that might be subject to U.S. export controls. now do require an export license. So we've got investment restrictions, financial institution restrictions, and now you need licenses, which may be presumptively denied as the policy approach of the US government that are preventing companies from getting actual hardware and equipment into Russia. So that's sort of the third layer. And then I kind of wanted to end by kind of talking about some of the key questions that we get in this space often for clients. One that I've already touched on is Russia off limits? And again, the answer is no, Russia is not off limits. It's not a sanctioned and embargoed country. But again, it is increasingly challenging to do business there. And the US government is very much aware of that and is not uncomfortable with US companies being put in that position because while they may not be willing to put Russia on that sanctioned list, they don't want US companies to a large degree to be finding ways to do business in Russia that may perhaps provide revenues to the Russian government. Do all Russian investments need to be divested? No, again, that is not the case. But the US government did put in place general authorizations that allowed US companies to divest certain sanctioned investments to non-US persons. Many of those general licenses have wound down, and so a specific authorization is moved, but you don't need to divest from all of your Russian investments. And then, we get a lot of questions about why banks, in particular US banks, are not willing to process lawful payments regarding Russia. And the answer is a risk tolerance. And as we see as the events on the ground in Ukraine and the invasion and the attacks continue, the US government continues to escalate its sanctions restrictions and they continue to build upon each other. And then finally, kind of moving on to the next slide, I think the key point there that I want to focus on is that the restrictions against Russia that are impacting all industries are not just US focused. This is a global coordinated effort. And so companies really not only need to manage US restrictions, but they also need to be top of mind to the EU and UK rules and how those all intersect. And while there may be coordinated sanctions, there are, of course, divergence in how the various jurisdictions deals with these issues, and companies need to be sensitive to that. So thank you for the time and opportunity to share that snapshot with you about what Russia sanctions look like today.
Yeah, I think I'm on. Anyway, well, when I come back later, I want to talk to you about deemed export and see if you talk about Russian nationals in the U.S. In the universities, we always worry about that, as you know. I'm looking down, just kind of looking at you on the screen here. And this is now a perfect segue over to Mayowa, Kuyoro, who is a partner at McKinsey in Nigeria, where she joined as the first business analyst, leads the firm's fintech work across Africa and its financial services practice in West Africa. With over 10 years of experience, Mayowa works closely with private, public, and social sector institutions across Africa on corporate finance, growth, large-scale transformation, strategies for foreign direct investment, etc. Leads the firm's work with startup companies, especially fintech. And so this is another great segue because we're talking about the financial side. And fintech, or new financial technologies, obviously many of you know, you follow at least sort of cryptocurrencies and blockchain and whatnot, but this is a very hot segment of the marketplace. And if you have these new and different ways of payment systems, might that kind of be a way of addressing what Ann was talking about in a sort of fractured geopolitical environment? Can we have alternate currencies and ways to do it so that even if you have government regulations, that there are ways then to evade that? So let me now turn it over to Mayowa for her comments.
Okay, thank you so much, Sean. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Yes.
Wonderful, thank you. As Sean said, my name is Mayowa Kuyoro. I am a partner based out of the Lagos office, and I spend quite a bunch of my time working on topics related to innovation in financial services. I actually got into the whole fintech space by accident a couple of years ago when an investor was looking to sort of exit its stake in one of the early fintech companies in Africa. Actually, I ended up being one of the first unicorns out of the continent. And I absolutely fell in love with that. And it's been very, very fulfilling for me to sort of watch a trajectory of fintech across the continent. particularly in the country where I'm from, Nigeria. And this year, we wrote a report, I think that came out in August, around the fintech landscape in Africa and what it looks like. So I'm going to share with you some insights from the report. First of all, we think that we're at the end, and the title of the report was Fintech, the End of the Beginning. And we think that we're actually sort of at the tip of the inflection point for Africa for a number of reasons, which I will go into shortly. The one thing that, sort of really got me very excited about the whole space was just the potential for fintech and technology to actually give people a sort of financial freedom and give people access to financial services. Africa is a region where close to 60% of the adult population does not have access to basic financial services. And we're seeing that fintechs have actually helped drive a structural shift in financial services. Now, across a lot of markets, sort of basic financial services are run-of-the-mill. People have a mobile money wallet. Africa is actually the biggest, the region in the world that has the largest number of mobile wallets today, as well as use. And now we see white spaces in advanced services, so lending, in data utilization, distribution capabilities, and so on and so forth. One of the biggest insights that we got when we were doing the research, actually, was that Africa's fintech has penetrated the financial services market quite significantly. So we did this exercise of sizing the entire financial services market. And then we said, what is the revenue of fintech companies today that we can track? And therefore, that was the penetration. And we are at an average of 3 to 5%. The thing that blew my mind out of the statistic is that this is the same level when you do the same sort of calculation in markets such as the United States, markets such as Europe, to have a similar level of penetration of the financial services market. So we're not as nascent as we thought we were. And then also in some markets such as Kenya, in some markets such as Ghana, you actually have even higher penetration. And I'll talk about the differences very soon. Kenya and Ghana are regions where the telecom providers play quite a significant role in financial technology today. And this is one of the dynamics that makes Africa slightly different from the rest of the world when it comes to financial services. Finally, we see sort of 4 major archetypes in Africa. We have traditional banking countries such as South Africa and Morocco, where the banks, they're really leading in the innovation of financial services across. We have mobile money specialists, like I spoke to previously, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Ghana. We have markets that we say are disruption ready. So Nigeria and Egypt are prime examples of such markets. Nigeria alone Nigeria alone accounted for 45% of all venture investment into the African venture space last year. So we're actually punching above our weight in terms of the amount of money coming in. I think what will be interesting for you to know and notice that American investors, US-based investors, actually a significant proportion of the money coming into Africa. And then we have some high potential markets such as Cote d'Ivoire, Cameroon, and Senegal, which are on the Francophone West Africa axis, where we're seeing some early signs of disruption there. Finally, on the right-hand side, I think one of the things that's very exciting about the African financial services space and also fintech actually is that we expect to see the revenues in this industry grow at about 9% per annum. And that's even faster than GDP growth. I think this is one of the industries that actually bucked the trend when it comes to GDP growth. And we expected to see that, we expected to see it's going to grow to over $200 billion by 2025. And we, really, really believe that we're at the inflection point and Africa is moving along the S curve. So let me just take you through very quickly some thoughts, based off of that. I mentioned that, today, fintech revenue is potentially, 3.8 billion. We think that if we get to penetration similar to markets such as Kenya, which is about % penetration, and Kenya, which is about 13% penetration, we can actually grow 3 times over the next 3 to 4 years. So I think there is quite a lot of excitement about the space, and we're seeing a lot of that reflected in investor activity. We're seeing a lot of that reflected in the number of startups and the number of venture businesses that are coming into the market. When I started sort of tracking the industry in 2018, 2019, I said maybe there was perhaps 100 or so venture-backed companies. That number has exploded to over 400 in the last 3 to 4 years, and you can see some of the reasons why. This is a very busy slide, so let me ask for forgiveness sort of upfront. Essentially, what we try to do and understand is, fintech is actually a very broad term, and everyone thinks fintech. What does it actually mean? And we try to lay out various different verticals where we see fintech activity today, and we try to sort of overlay that with where do we see disruption already, and who's leading the disruption? Is it incumbents, which in our markets are banks, or who tend to be very, very fast followers, but sometimes innovators, but also telecom companies. So you imagine your T-Mobile being such or your AT&T being such an integral part of your financial services ecosystem. That is what we observe in some of the markets that we see in Africa. And then some areas where we say they're white spaces, nobody's doing much there, but we believe that the market is trending towards them. And from the left-hand side of the chart all the way through to the right-hand side of the chart, things get a little bit more complicated. So on the left-hand side of the chart, you have the very, very simple account management, wallets, which are huge in some markets. Let me give you a simple stat. In a market like Ghana, in a market like Kenya, the amount of money that is moved through a wallet today is sort of 150 times GDP, right? So it's 150, 1.5 times GDP, 150% of the GDP is moved through mobile money. That's how sort of pervasive in the fabric of society wallets are in some markets today. Then we also have sort of payments, and this is being able to, this is the equivalent to your Stripe or your Square, being able to do sort of online payments and offline payments, and then remittances as well. I think we're somewhere, Africa is probably somewhere in between number 3 and number 4 in terms of the maturity of our ecosystem. Where we're beginning to see emerging hotbeds of activity is sort of from 5 all the way through to 7, where there's retail lending, insurance penetration across the continent is very low. It's about 3% of the population has an insurance product today, and we're seeing some very interesting companies coming in to try and disrupt and innovate around insurance distribution today. And then wealth management, as people are getting more and more disposable income, people are asking questions around, what do I do with this money? How do I save? And you have some very interesting startups. One of them is Bamboo, which kind of looks like Robinhood, where you can do fractional investing, right? You can buy a fraction of a stock, and so on and so forth. So very, very interesting thing. And then the final one is blockchain, crypto, and DeFi. And here, I think we're very, very, very nascent. Regulators are still trying to understand how to think about this. There's quite a few of them are actually open and exploring, but quite cautiously so. And so, we don't have as many technology companies that are focused on this. There are a few in the market, but not as many. And these 8 are supported by an infrastructure layer at the bottom that help to enable the activities at the top of the house. And then finally, like I said, we expect to see the financial services industry sort of grow by 9%. Again, if you think about GDP is probably growing at 4 or 5%. So this is growing faster than the GDP of a lot of countries. And this is driven by a number of financial services verticals. One is wallets, right? We think wallets have not, for example, pervaded Nigeria today. They only started looking into this in the last 12 months. And if we grow as fast as a Kenya or a Ghana have done in the past, or even some of the other Francophone West African countries, we're going to see quite an explosion in the use of wallets. And in Nigeria, this is a product that is factored for the bottom of the pyramid, which contributes about 30 or 40% of adults who do not have access to financial services. Another big area we are expecting to see grow is lending, as I mentioned, because most people in terms of financial services only have access to very basic financial services. And all of this is off the back of the fact that we are seeing infrastructure rapidly catch up. We have increasing mobile penetration, we have increasing digital penetration, and we have a lot of the regulators, a lot of central banks spending quite a bit of time thinking about how to drive financial inclusion in the market. So we do expect to see quite positive externalities helping to drive growth in the financial services industry. So, just in summary, I think, the three things I'll say. One is it's a big opportunity, it's exciting, it's growing very fast. Secondly, it actually has the potential to really transform and impact people's lives. And thirdly, Africa is really at the end of the beginning when it comes to the fintech industry, and it's going to be exciting to see how we innovate going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Thanks so much for that. And I will want to maybe perhaps return to you in the discussion to discuss about in the geopolitical situation, how do African companies think about aligning with, whether it's with China, who's making a lot of investments there, the U.S., does that provide a difficult space in trying to navigate? Now I want to turn us to our last panelist, who is Marcus Valverde, who is the founding partner of Malcus Valverde Society de Abogados. I'm sure I did not pronounce that well. He frequently assists clients that are resident and non-resident in Brazil on day-to-day corporate and contractual issues, restructurings and corporate governance matters, as well as in venture capital, private equity, and M&A transactions. In addition to transactional capabilities, he's sought after by clients for the resolution of shareholder and MA-related disputes as a conciliator. He also was a chairman in Sterling in the New York office, and so has that experience here in the U.S. Now, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you will be our final speaker. Give us the perspective from the Americas.
Hi, good morning, and thank you for having me here. I would also like to thank Boston College of Law for the opportunity and for organizing this very interesting summit, and for Robes and Gray. I had the chance to study at Harvard with two current Robes and Gray partners, Regina, who is sitting here, and Saeko, who now works with M&A in the Tokyo office. And what I have to say is they're both amazing professionals. They were amazing students as well. And I'm very happy to see them working together and also being part of the same team. So my presentation will focus on innovation in Latin America, because I'm very knowledgeable about Brazil and what's going on in the VC community, VC financings in Brazil. I'll focus my presentation here. I think focusing in Brazil is actually useful and good. I'm going to explain this in my you're going to see this in my concluding remarks. But it's a country of continental size, so we're very we have a very important part of the, let's say, Latin American market. And this graph here is hard to believe, actually, but it comes from very good sources, both the Brazilian Venture Capital and Private Equity Association and KPMG. And what you can see from the first graph over here is that in 2017, these numbers are all in reais, so you have to divide them by 5, approximately 5, a little bit over 5. But what you can see is that in 2017, we had less than $200 million invested in venture capital transactions in the country. And if you fast forward to 2020, you will see that that number is almost $3 billion. So we experienced a dramatic growth. I would say that on a consistent basis, we see around 10 law firms in Brazil doing VC financings. I would say that more frequently we see 5 law firms, and we're fortunate to be one of these 5 law firms. So you can imagine how the last 5 to 6 years have been for us in the country, and how we have been busy with all the transactions. And if we have a few numbers from 2021 over here, and if you see, we went from $3 billion US to $9 billion US. So in a year, we grew 3 times. If you get the numbers from 2017 to 2020, the market grew 15 times. So it's not 15%, it's 15 times. And then with this introduction, I'll try to speak a little bit about market developments and then legal developments, and then I'll move to a brief conclusion. So in terms of market developments, what I have to say is that the market became much more sophisticated. It's actually a very sophisticated market at this point. We have now over 800 health tech companies in Brazil, health tech startups in Brazil. We have a series of funds also dedicated to just life sciences and health tech companies. There was a study published last year by one of the main venture capital associations in the country. We actually happen to also represent this venture capital association. And the study showed that there are over 200 very professionalized and sophisticated investment houses, let's just call them investment houses for now, executing venture capital investments in the country. And what we also saw from this study is that most, if not all, of these institutions or investment houses have very clear investment policies. They're clearly focused on 1 or 2 industries. So from that you can see that the market is very sophisticated. Right now, in terms of players we see in the market, we have foreign funds, so funds organized in Cayman or in the US that have local managers, or at least 1 or 2 managers in Brazil. We also see a series of local funds that were structured. One very interesting thing about Brazil, you cannot think of Brazil without thinking about BNDES, which is the Brazilian Development Bank. BNDES, a couple of years ago, 3 to 4 years ago, they actually played a very important role in developing the market. They actually started to create incentivized funds. So these are funds that if you're a limited partner, an investor of the fund, you get a lot of tax benefits out of that. These tax benefits were applied more to big Brazilian corporate companies, corporates. And so we have now a lot of, I would say, over 10 incentivized funds in the country. Some of these funds are, let's say, ESG oriented, or they only work with the development of technology in the Amazon region. We also happen to represent 2 of these funds that work with the Amazon and have some ESG focus in the region. We also have 2 other very relevant players that I think in the last 5 years they played an important role, but in the next 5 years I think they're going to be essential for the market, which are venture builders. We have local venture builders, and in this last year, I think it's a trend, we are seeing venture builders from the United States and Europe coming to Brazil. And we also have CVCs, which are corporate venture capitals. So big corporates organizing their own funds and their own investment structures to invest in Brazil. In the life sciences industry, we have 2 very important ones. We have DASA, which is a main lab, the fourth biggest lab in Latin America. They have their own investment structure, and we have Grupo Fleury, which is also the second biggest lab in Brazil, also doing VC investments. So as you can see, in terms of market development, we have very sophisticated players and a lot of players as well. In terms of legal developments, I cannot speak about legal developments without explaining that there is kind of a competition when investing in Brazil. If you're going to use Brazilian law and Brazilian investment funds and legal structures, or if you're going to use funds headquartered in Cayman or Delaware, those are the ones we see more, and then Delaware law or US law or Cayman law. I'm a US lawyer as well, so I'm also involved in cross-border transactions and financings in Brazil. And then what we see is that if you use like the business law, corporate law framework for Cayman and Delaware, they're actually, I have to say this, they're actually better, more flexible, and tend to promote easier investments. But Brazil is a big country, and we see a lot of startups. And so in terms of tax incentives, if you're an investor, it might be simpler for you to be in Brazil. You have more tax incentives. You have less taxes levied on you, irrespective of whether you have a tax incentive or not. And also, these startup companies are traditionally sold to other Brazilian, like if you're an entrepreneur, you're probably going to end up selling your company to a big Brazilian corporate or to a subsidiary of a global corporation that is located in Brazil. So for tax reasons. So if you set up your company, your startup company abroad, you might face a few challenges tax-wise. So there's this competition. What do you want to, let's say, focus on more? Having a more flexible corporate business structure, or having taxes that are less detrimental to your business. And then this competition is going forward, I think, in the next 5 years as well. But what we have seen in the country is we have federal laws being enacted that are helping, but I'm very critical of this. I don't think they're helping that much. But you have regulation, and sometimes industry regulation, that has been very beneficial. And then we also have the private practice, the law firms, and just private players, corporations, that are doing a very good job at standardizing contracts, standardizing terms, and making this a very sophisticated investment environment. And then going to my conclusions, I have another 2 minutes here. What I see is that we're going to see, probably in the next year, we're already discussing this with the legislative, we're going to see funds becoming more flexible in Brazil, so we're going to see an increase in foreign investments investing through Brazilian structures. And we're also seeing, in terms of life sciences, a trend that in the last 5 years, there were a lot of investments in digital health, and we're speaking to the major players in this industry, and what we see is that probably in the next 5 years, and we're starting to see this, what we're going to see is an increase in investments in biotech. So some of the big corporations that work with life sciences are already starting their own accelerator programs and kind of venture building. They don't want to call it that, but they're kind of venture building biotech companies. And one last remark that I have here to say is that Brazil has become a very sophisticated market. If we see from all the panels that we heard before, what we noticed is from the developing countries, we face a lot of problems with Russia now, for obvious reasons. We have problems with China. India has always been a very complicated market. And Brazil is not so complicated anymore, I would say. It's actually a very good place to invest in. And the legal structure has developed significantly, as you can see from the presentation. So I think we're seeing that for the next 5 years we're seeing a continuation of what we saw in the previous 5 years. I don't think we're going to experience 15 times of growth again. I hope we do, but I don't see that coming. But still, I think we have a very good investment opportunities, different from other countries. Like the other day, I was talking to Uri Levin, who's the founder of Uber, and he was saying, look, when we start companies in Israel, he's from Israel. These companies have to go global, the startup companies. We don't hear as much about the Brazilian startup companies, just because the country is so big that there are so many opportunities to develop the company in the country that they just don't go abroad. But it's good that I'm here and I get the chance to introduce you to the legal market in Brazil. Thank you very much.
Okay, great set introductory remarks. We've kind of set up the playing field quite well. I will take the moderator's prerogative and do some directed questions first, but I'm only going to take maybe 10 minutes for that because I want to have plenty of time for all of you to ask questions. As we move, where are the microphones going to be? Somebody will... Okay, good. So when we get to that point, then again, wait for the microphone to come to you. Because I believe this is being recorded. Is that the case? Yeah, so that's the importance of the microphone again, so that people who watch the recording later can hear it. So a couple of directed questions first. Michael, going back to you, and I know that in your USPTO capacity, there's some limits on what you can speak of, but I have a question actually around, I've been hearing that the Chinese in particular have been really increasing the amount of trademark filings they're doing in the PTO, and there's even been some, and this just trickles to me, and I sort of still practice on the side of being an academic as well, to where there's perhaps even some deceptiveness going on, or can you speak a little bit of that? Is there an increase both in the trademark filings and the patent filings, and what impact do you see that having on the system?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. And this is
these microphones are on. You might need to touch something for that. Sounds like you're on. Good, perfect.
I don't know if I have to pull that up closer. You can hear me okay? That's good. Okay, great. Yeah, that's a great topic. I just did a program in Berkeley 2 days ago on this topic. So, and that program was recorded. It was 90 minutes talking about the trademark filings into the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. It's really something I started studying when I was IP attaché in Shanghai almost 8 years ago, because we started seeing more filings coming in from China, and a good percentage of those were fraudulent. If you take a look at there are two NYU professors that did some studies on the percentage of fake filings that were coming in and how many fake specimens of use were being used as a basis for those filings. I think at that time we started looking at what were some of the factors affecting those filings coming into the United States. At that time, I think, and we identified a number of non-market factors that were really influencing them. I think top of that list were the subsidy programs that China was starting to implement, primarily to try to develop and strengthen brand competitiveness internationally and develop global brands. They started to issue mandates to local municipalities to increase filing numbers, both domestically and internationally. And as a result of that, the local government started to incentivize filings by providing subsidies. In many cases, those subsidies greatly exceeded the total cost of filing trademarks. So as a result, many opportunistic individuals that said, hey, I can make money just off of filing trademark applications, even though I have no legitimate purpose or reason to do that, and I'm not going to be using those marks in commerce. So that was kind of the first wave that we started to see back in 2016, 17. And then really, and we published a report. You can also go onto USPTO.gov under our China IP website and see a report that talked about that phenomenon and how it was influencing not just trademarks, but also patent filing numbers, non-market influences there. Really, over the pandemic, though, we saw a much bigger increase and surge in the number of filings, and that really started to capture our attention. This was more based on commercial incentives and companies trying to gain access to consumers directly as a result of the pandemic. So you saw a lot of the smaller manufacturers in southern China that were traditionally relying on traditional supply chains to get their products out of the country now had to rely on e-commerce platforms, and so we started to see a surge in that type of activity. And some of the platforms provide incentives if you have, and certain benefits if you have a trademark registration. And we saw trademark agents in China that were providing kind of a full range of services to get people on the platforms and providing inaccurate information on how they could file trademarks and actually registering trademarks themselves, the agents, and then warehousing those trademarks and then selling them, which if you practice trademark law in the United States, you know that you can't do. And so that was the second surge that we started to see. And so PTO has been taking a number of steps to try to address those, including, I think 2 or 3 years ago you saw that we initiated a new, what we call a local counsel rule, where if you're filing from outside the United States, which most countries do already, the U.S. was one of the very few countries that allowed you to file pro se directly into our system. Now you have to use a U.S. Trademark lawyer in order to do that, a number of other measures. But that's what we've been dealing with. And I think I'll just point out a positive about that is that this has opened up a new avenue for us to engage with CNIPA, the China National Intellectual Property Administration, because obviously they're facing the same issue. Their incentives there, or their motivation was not to increase the number of fake filings. They're seeing the same type of behavior by trademark agents in China. So they're sanctioning on their side. We're sanctioning the filings on our side. We're exchanging information. We're engaging on that. It's interesting. Some of the sanctions that we had, the largest filer, I think, a trademark agent, was about a year ago, who filed over 15,000 fraudulent marks into the United States. We sanctioned that trademark agent. Many of them were not being used, the trademarks. They had already been sanctioned by CNIPA for abuse of IP subsidies. And so I think this is one of those positive areas where we can actually engage and advance our relationship.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks. Emma, I want to turn it back to you. And as I said before, I would love it if you'd speak a little bit about deemed export issues. And again, particularly, we have Russian nationals who are still in universities, on locations. What do we all have to be aware of, given the heightened sanctions now?
Yeah, in terms of exports, most people think about it kind of in the traditional model, right? Put an item in a box and ship it overseas, right? And that's sort of the traditional construct for thinking of an export control transaction. But under the deemed export rules, if you have a foreign national in the United States or in a third country who has access to, or technology or source code is released to that foreign national in the United States, that is deemed to be an export to that foreign national's home country. And if an export license would be needed to transfer that technology or source code to Russia, an export control license will be needed to release that technology or source code to a Russian national or other foreign national, perhaps in the United States. So in particular, Sean, as you noted, for universities, research institutions, the deemed export issue is one that we see a lot of footfalls being made. And with the expansion of the export controls with respect to Russia, it's not just the most sensitive technology that is going to be subject to these rules. So it's going to be increasingly important for institutions, research institutions, universities to really assess as part of their export control regime if they do have foreign nationals on board, either on staff or through collaboration agreements, to make sure they're assessing if any technology is being released to them. And by release, that's not necessarily anything particularly fancy, right? It can be showing blueprints, sending emails with the information that is about development or production of controlled technology. So that is going to be an increasingly complex landscape for universities to manage.
Thanks. Universities, and also I suppose too, startups where we have Russian nationals who come in and depending on their visa status, but this is at the edges of my knowledge. I just know enough to be dangerous, so call Emma. You're at a university.
Absolutely.
And she will guide you through. Mayowa, I want to return to you as well and talk to you about Africa is developing quickly, has a lot of homegrown technologies in its own companies, and really is then therefore becoming a power in its own right. How do the companies you're seeing and nations in Africa still kind of grapple with, China has been trying to do a lot of investments in there, the U.S. and the West, and obviously you've got still sort of post-colonial issues. what's from the view on the ground there? What's the best way, or how do you see companies trying to navigate that? While again, they're trying to be homegrown. We want to own everything here and not just look like we are dependent on other powers in the world.
I think that's a very interesting question. I think it is very relevant depending on the type of industry you're looking at. So there's been a lot of, for example, the Chinese are huge with infrastructure and they're huge with government debt, right? And so there's been a lot of movement in that space around, are we too indebted to the Chinese? How do we make sure that what we're building, the infrastructure that's being built, airports, roads, et cetera, are at the right level of quality, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, if I look at the financial services vertical, for the most part, it's not a conversation that comes up a lot, and I'll tell you why. Usually with the entrepreneurs who are raising capital and raising funding in our markets, a lot of them are homegrown. The checks that are being written are not they're not big enough to be material, and the investor stack looks, quite diversified. You have investors from Europe, you have investors from the US. There's probably only one startup and unicorn that is Chinese backed. And to be honest, if you ask people, do they know it's Chinese backed because it's a consumer facing vertical, the answer is no. So, in financial services, that debate around the source of funding is not yet or isn't yet material enough because the checks are still not very big.
Thanks so much for that. The last directed question, Marcus, and it's a similar question. And so you are, in fact, telling us an account of how in Brazil there's perhaps going to be a move to use more Brazilian entities. That had traditionally been, of course, sort of Delaware law. Although I wonder if for the cross-border transactions, for the law governing the deal itself, would that be New York law, not necessarily the Delaware's for the corporate governance side, but then how fast do you see this transitioning happening, and how effective will it be for Brazilian companies to say, no, we really want it to be a Brazilian entity, and we're going to use Brazilian law as the governing law for the transaction, for the corporate governance, et cetera?
Thank you for the question. Probably it's the best and most practical question that you could have asked for the people here to understand. Well, I think that the conflict or the competition between the two jurisdictions is never going to end. I would say it will remain something between 50% each way. And the reason for this is, I will give you an example. We have something against using Brazilian law. We have labor laws from 1943, which provide for joint and several liability between the company and the controlling shareholders. So you would have a founder being liable for labor matters. We have ways around it. We have indemnification. We have D&O insurance. We have ways around this, but still, it's a big issue. But we also have other things that are being developed in Brazil. For instance, there's a provisional measure that was issued in September now, providing that foreign investors who invest in Brazilian funds for venture capital purpose, for infrastructure purposes, the taxation levied on whatever they gain from those investments is reduced to zero now. This needs to be turned into law, so there's a whole discussion, but it likely will because of all the economic scenario. So I don't see this going away. I think it's probably going to increase a little bit more in terms of using Brazilian law. And you're right, we see mostly New York law being used. In some transactions, for other reasons, we see Cayman law being used, but the documents are pretty much U.S. documents.
Perfect, thanks for that. Yeah, so it sounds like a smart policy looking at tax incentives and ways to then tilt people towards and using the Brazilian entity system itself. Okay, now as promised, yes, 5 minutes, and so let's turn it to audience questions. So there's a microphone, looks like the first hand is right here, so directly behind. And then I will kind of start a queue. Did I see other hands going up?
My question is for Marcus. I wanted to ask about the upcoming election in Brazil, and if you predict, whether a Lula victory and a return to leftist governance, or a possibly contested election, given Bolsonaro's rhetorical track record, could lead to any upheaval in the recent economic growth that Brazil has experienced.
Thank you, great question. Yeah, I should have expected that a question like this would be raised. It's hard to say who's going to win the election. It's uncertain. I don't see Bolsonaro having the force to question the election, similar to what happened in the U.S. I don't think he can make that. And the reason for that is that we have a very strong judiciary system. But I would say that if Lula wins, one of the things we're going to see is that BNDES, the Development Bank of Brazil, which is a major player in the country, they're probably going to expand. In the previous Lula administration, BNDES was bigger and larger, and so we saw more investments in venture capital and innovation from that end. But we also have a very robust private investment sector for innovation in Brazil. So I would say we're not going to have any problems there, but if Lula is elected, probably we're going to have a better local scenario for innovation and investment in innovation.
Yeah. Amy, next question.
I think it was here. I think it's
Oh, I'm sorry. A terrible moderator. Okay, here's the microphone.
Sure. Actually, for Marcus, you as well. I have an anecdotal, personal impression that Brazil has been difficult as market access, similar to India, for U.S. companies. And I think you were alluding this to a little bit at the end, so not quite on point with the investment side, but I'm curious if you have any impressions of that changing as well to enable more U.S.-based companies to more effectively operate in Brazil.
That's a great question. There's when GE set up its office in Brazil a long time ago, there was a saying in their training. It was, Brazil is not for starters, and I think that will remain the same. I don't think that's going to change. But I think it's easier to invest in Brazil than in India and other. I have worked with in transactions with India, cross-border transactions, and I believe that it's easier to work with Brazil. I don't see a lot of. I see timid legislative federal laws bringing development. What I see is like sector-driven development. So, for instance, in the life science area, we recently saw also in March now a regulation from the Health Agency of Brazil regulating software as a medical device. We were waiting for this for a long time, and it was finally out. So we see the agency, the regulatory agencies for specific sectors, bringing this development.
Great, thanks. Amy, I think you get our last question.
Wonderful. I feel special. Thank you all for being here today. I have a question that goes more towards other panelists and centered around tools for return on investment. I think traditionally in the United States that's been seen in patents, but just given the difficulties of software and biotechnology to really rely on the patentability of patents, or I guess new inventions in that area, specifically around really novel and game-changing software such as in the fintech space. What tools are being used or are driving investors such that they see a return on investment possibility? Is that patents, or are they using other tools of IP or potentially even outside of IP?
Let me do some direction here. Mayowa, do you want to take that on first?
Yeah, so fintech's a little bit different from biotech in the sense that actually people want to make their ecosystems as easy to plug into, and there's a lot of talk about APIs and so on and so forth. And the measure of success really is about the number of people on your platform, what usage looks like, how many transactions are you processing, and so on and so forth. So it's less around IP and more around access to markets. in the fintech space. And one of the things actually that is becoming an increasing part of the conversation is the ability to monetize, right? You know, it's not only now enough to have customers, it's not only enough to have people plug into your platform, you have to monetize. And that's where a lot of investors are focusing their questions and their efforts at the moment.
Emma, do you want to speak to this? I'll make sure you get an opportunity as well.
Yeah, I'll just add a quick note to that in terms of, you know, where we see sort of return on investment. I think from a trade regulatory perspective, even though the sanctions regimes, the export control regimes are expanding across jurisdictions, not just Russia, we have China, there is an attempt by the US government to protect, you know, there's IP protection built into sanctions authorization. So the maintenance and prosecution of patents are something that is exempt from, in most jurisdictions, sanctions and export control restrictions. So it's clear that from a trade compliance perspective, you know, patents are seen as, an IP protection is seen as one of the tools of investment that the US government in particular is still looking to protect and to leverage for US investors.
Thank you. I think I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative here. We're a little bit over time, and so I want to draw the panel to a close. I want to thank all of our excellent panelists. Join me in thanking them. Before I conclude, I want to thank him again, and I want to thank Ed Kelly at Boston Galway and Regina Sanpenti at Ropes and Gray, because as the co-chairs, this was just a phenomenal panel, and it really was due to them. Thanks so much.
Thanks for moderating. Thank you to our panelists. We now have a break until 10:50, at which time we'll come back and talk about IP protections. Have they gone too far? We'll hear from academics, practitioners, from the Senate, and from the judiciary. So it should be quite interesting. So you can refresh your coffee, stretch your legs, and we'll get started on our next panel at 10:50.